My name is Sarah Fagan. I'm the Managing Director at Adare, and we're delighted, both myself and my colleagues here today, to provide you with the latest HR Barometer report, Series 8.2. So, the HR Barometer report is in its 8th year and 12th publication, and is the result of extensive research conducted by my colleagues in Adare, surveying hundreds of HR practitioners and business leaders around the country. And the data relates to over 74,000 employees, so it's very relevant. The purpose of the report is to provide you insights into the emerging trends and priorities that are impacting employers, how we benchmark HR metrics and provide that information to our audiences, like this morning, or any of our clients, is really to ensure that there's tangible data that can help inform and support decision-making processes and provide some forecasts on areas that are anticipated over the coming year. And as we approach 2025, there are so many considerations for businesses in all sectors. Competition in markets is absolutely driving innovation, and the right type of investments is the demarcation of those who will maintain sustainability and those who will thrive in their growth journeys. Prior to that, it's always important to take an initial step back and look at the macro impacts that are influencing sectoral and industry decisions. So, when we're considering some of the macro influencers, we obviously have to refer to the geopolitical tensions, the high but decreasing inflation that we've experienced over the last 24 months, the impact of interest rates, and now the impending US election, which may impact on the movement of trade. And for the Irish economy in particular, that could result in significant supply chain challenges. And while the Irish economy has definitely proved its resilience over the last number of years, it is slightly reminiscent of 2016, 2017, where in Ireland the economy was outperforming its international counterparts and managing the impact of a high but decreasing inflation at that point. And even then, there were high employment levels and skill shortages. But the primary difference being those shortages were only impacting certain sectors. Whereas now, as a collective, we're facing a continued skills shortage that is global, and it's expected to continue over the next number of years. So, when we're considering our journeys of growth over the next 3, 5, and even 10 years, we have to operate in a manner that acknowledges the continued skill shortages and look inward at our businesses to drive people-led transformation and talent development that steps outside of the box when it comes to our labour and skills shortages, and essentially looks at the development in that area and where we as business leaders can actually make an impact in our own businesses. And that is why investment in HR is so important. And to act as a strategic partnership with HR and the business is now instrumental for HR leaders to be at the top table, influencing the strategic journey of our businesses, driving innovative practices, and managing talent in a way that has never been done before. In order to do that, we must ensure that whatever investment is being made in our businesses and in our people, that we can attribute that investment to certain gains. Investment in HR is no longer a cost to the business, but a lever for growth. But how can we expect to yield those gains or obtain a return on investment if we're not identifying, I should say, the exact metrics that will result in business outcomes? So, as HR leaders, it is crucial to identify the measurements that are unique to your own businesses in order to maintain continuous agility and make those informed decisions. As always, we always start off with the strategic priorities when it comes to looking forward into 2025. And over the last number of years, there's been a lot of similarities in terms of the strategic priorities that are at play. First up, we have employee engagement and experience as a top priority for our survey participants, with almost 1 in 2 saying that it's going to be their strategic priorities going into 2025. And as always, when it comes to employee engagement and experience, organizations across sectors have been really instrumental in ensuring that they are reacting to the environment, in particular in a post-pandemic environment. It's so essential that there is a personalized approach when it comes to employee engagement and experience. Cultivating a sense of purpose and aligning the work with broader organizational values is instrumental in ensuring that you're fostering a culture where employees are feeling connected to their work, but balancing that with the autonomy to empower employees to take ownership and pride in their work. When it comes to the second top priority, again, similar to our last HR Barometer survey, almost one in two, so 48% of survey participants are saying that talent retention is a key priority. And whilst we have, I think, quite effectively been managing talent retention over the last number of years, we need to ensure that, again, we're bringing certain innovation into our retention strategies. Improved benefits will only take you so far, and a lot of organizations are looking to the future and adapting the continued global skills shortage by analyzing and trying to find patterns in the data, in their metrics, to effectively identify positive and negative trends so that they can get ahead of it. And that's going to be instrumental in going into 2025 when we're at full employment and obviously a global skills shortage dictating or influencing what we are doing in that area. More interestingly, we're seeing that talent acquisition has fallen a little bit, but is still a top third priority for organizations and businesses across sectors, with 1 in 4, 25% saying that they're focusing on talent acquisition. And essentially, when it comes to talent acquisition, we're seeing a broader approach to attracting a key talent and skills into your business. In particular, when we consider talent acquisition in 2025, it's really about ensuring your value proposition is front and center and your brand is aligned to the demographics within the skilled workforce, who you're trying to attract, and ensuring that you're tailoring those requirements will be essential in the coming year. The fourth and fifth priorities relate to learning and development and succession planning, some of which we have some key metrics pulled out from our survey this time around to be able to share with you. And whilst we are seeing investment continuing to increase in the L&D space, it's all about ensuring that you're identifying what are the appropriate metrics within your business that are providing you with that return on investment and driving those tangible business outcomes. So throughout the next hour, myself and my colleagues will present some of those key data and key metrics to enable you to forecast what might be happening across sectors and help inform your strategic decision-making processes as you plan and prepare for 2025. So in brief, I'll just go through the running order. I'll shortly introduce you to my colleague Amanda Finnegan, Head of Retained Services, who will be looking at some of those key HR metrics, as well as working practices. And as we've seen the publication of the Code of Practice on the right to request for remote working, we're starting to, I suppose, gain insights into what's happening within businesses. Whilst it's definitely at its infancy in terms of the publication of the code, what is happening at third parties, WRCs, and so forth is important because that is likely going to increase in the upcoming year. We'll then be joined by my colleague, Michelle McDonough, Head of HR Consulting, who's going to bring you through some of the data and insights into gender pay gap reporting, what is happening in the area, in particular as we move to headcounts of 50 plus next year. Are you preparing now? Are your HR leadership teams taking ownership of that and ensuring that they're driving it in the right way to coincide with the pay transparency directive that is upcoming over the next couple of years? Michelle will also discuss what's happening in performance management, in particular as we remain operating in a hybrid work environment. It's more important than ever that we're having these discussions. We're understanding what's happening across markets and sectors in relation to performance management to help inform your decision-making processes. And obviously then touching on retirement and pensions, we've seen the government delay the introduction of the auto enrollment, but there's still a lot of key insights that we'd like to share with you. Finally, I'll rejoin towards the end of the webinar to provide you some of the insights relating to pay and benefits, in particular as we're approaching the end of the year and the conversations are being had in relation to salary reviews and bonus payments. What's happening across markets and the averages are really important now to help inform what you're going to be doing in your business. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Amanda Finnegan, who's going to bring you through some of those key HR metrics and working practices. Amanda, you're very welcome.
Thank you, Sarah. Good morning, everybody. I think, Sarah, you highlighted how we need to really be playing our role in HR specialist practitioners or those who are looking after the HR element to help organizations remain competitive. And the metrics that we're going to be looking at now, which is how many of our HR people how many people do we need to focus on HR, turnover, and learning and development, give us some key insights to our organizational health and effectiveness. So if we're looking at those kind of things, it's really, really key for us to kind of put our finger on the pulse. And this is exactly why I love the HR Barometer report. It gives us insights to that. So our first view that we're going to be looking at is how many fixed term HR people do we need in our organization to really be effective? And this has been going on an upward trend over the last 2-3 years, where we've seen organizations really honing in on that strategic investment of bringing in HR specialists that make a difference. So at the moment, we're saying five is the average number of HR practitioners in the organization. This seems to be increasing, as I said, 1 in 5 are increasing it. And the percentage of increase in HR is potentially 15.5% from our last survey. That gives us a ratio of 1.5 to 100. I've done the math for us. It's about 1 to 66 employees. In other words, 1 fixed term HR individual to 66 employees. And that allows for HR to take the strategic initiatives well in hand. So if we are looking at employee engagement, what are the key things that we're doing to look after our employees' engagements, their sense of satisfaction and enjoyment of workplace? We're looking at really bringing performance management onto the cards, really making sure that our feedback is useful, time orientated. Our one-on-ones are doing what they need to be doing. We need HR to focus on these things. It's not a by the way, it's a definite golden thread for a healthy, effective organization. And so the number of HR people focusing on that is so important. And this is a data point that we can be using as organizations to advocate for bringing the right number of people into the business, focusing on our people health. Wellness is another point to focus, ESG. So there's a number of strategic initiatives our HR folk are taking care of for us, and that number is improved. So one of the other things that we look on is turnover. So if we move on to seeing what are some of the key metrics we've got there for you today. So 62% of organizations participating in the survey are absolutely increasing their headcount by 8.5. The volume that they're increasing is 8.5, and that is potentially to replace the turnover. You can see the intended turnover was 10.5. The expected for last year, for next year is 10%. Now, what I'm really encouraged by, and I'm sure you would have seen these numbers, is that it's slowly dropping. We were expecting the turnover of 2024 to be 14%. And earlier this year, we were saying potentially 2025 would have been 12%. So now that we're deep into 2024, our peers are saying it's actually slowing down. It was 12, it looks like it's going to be 10. So if we are looking at that increase of volume in staff, we're looking at how do we utilize them better? Are we looking at productivity increases? Is it to make our innovation strategy come alive? Those are the kind of things we are increasing our headcount for. Now, if we are retaining our staff, one of the big things that we have, a metric or an activity that we have, is learning and development. So if we move into learning and development and we ask ourselves, what are the key things we're focusing our energy on in learning and development? It's upskilling or reskilling for the future. And 96% of our participants said that was their number one priority. The second priority at 68% was continuous learning. So I need to do what I do really, really well. And 68% of us are focusing there. Employee-centric learning experiences was our third focus with 56%. And that ensures that as I'm in the organization and you are retaining me and you're wanting me to remain engaged, we focus on those employee-centric initiatives. Fourth, which is not on this slide, was agile organization. So if we are remaining competitive And we are looking for the future skills to complement that. We're looking at agility, and 40% of our participants was focusing on it. In learning and development, you'll notice we've got the percentage of payroll in 2024 at 4.6% and 2025 at 6%. And the idea there is you'll notice it slides up into 2025. And that is a very normative trend we see in learning and development. It's almost 1 year we invest and then we harvest, and then we invest and then we harvest. So the year of 2024 was a harvest year where we want our return on investment to really come home, and we own that. 2025 seems to be for our peers in human resource management across the island. Looks like it's going to be a year of investment. So 1 in 4 organizations are absolutely increasing their spend, and we're seeing that an average day is 4.2. So there are organizations that spend 5 days. There are also that go into the 2.5 days. So that's where what we're doing in the learning space. If we look specifically, and we look at the next slide that shows us how we've invested, where are we spending our time? 64% of our peers have been investing in learning and development initiatives that make sure that our organizations are growing. And they've invested some more. And when we look at what particularly they've invested in, is 43% have invested in homegrown e-learning content. In other words, we acknowledge that we've got the specialists internally, and we want to make use of the mode of learning of online learning. And so we create our own content, is what we've said. We sometimes don't have the specialists in task, organizations have said, and 42% of us then go external and get that content. And a lot of organizations have prioritized, thirdly, at 32%, soft skill development. A peer of mine, Michelle, which you'll meet shortly, will always call this hard skills. So things that really make a difference in our human relations. So can I communicate? Have I got the right self-leadership? Do I have the ability to have tough conversations? Can I problem solve? Do I do conflict resolutions? Those are kind of the investments that we're making. But when we use the word investment, we always want to return on it. And so when we ask organizations, do you actually measure return on investment? 1 in 10 organizations do. And when we do say, well, if you don't use that specific metric, what else do you measure? And then we're saying, well, people's engagement. 72% of us measure employee engagement through learning. We look at 60% of us look at knowledge retention and skills retention. So post the training, am I able to actually do what we learned? Some of us, 44% of us actually look at the activity on the learner management system. So completion rates and participation, likes, feedback. 44% also then look at the impact of performance metrics. So have I done what I said, and can I come back and apply it? We've got transferability of skills at 32%. And lastly, stakeholder satisfaction. So was that enjoyable to do at 32%? Sarah mentioned earlier on, really contextualize what good looks like for you. In other words, what is the metric, the return that you want? And actually just put a stake in the ground as a collective and say, what do you want to do differently? And that could be a really good start for your return on an investment in learning and development. If you do, however, wonder how would you go about putting that together, please visit our website. We've got an ebook that talks specifically around measuring, around talent management, and our ROI metric is in there, and a couple of suggestions if that doesn't work for you. Now, those insights give us a good health indicator. What's been happening in work practices? So if we look at what's been happening in the space of working practices in Ireland, we know we need to continue as organizations to adapt. Because, with the new Work-Life Balance Miscellaneous Provision Act that came in earlier this year, we need to look at that and be agile and really come with an open mind around what it is. So in 2023, we've seen a movement from fully remote to drop to 3%. Hybrid has increased to 76%, and fully on-site has remained at 21%. So that's our style within Ireland at the moment. The average number of days in the office remains at 2.7, so really showing that flexibility. That's been influenced by a defined number of days, and you can see that shifted from 65 to 68. Defined operational requirements has dropped a little bit. So us at the business saying our operational requirements need you to determine how many days you're in the office, or it's departmental requirements and team requirements. And we're going to shortly, not yet, but look at that. What are some of the challenges that we're facing? And you might see that's got an indication of potentially that increase from 11 to 15% in 2024. Overall, most organizations are finding that hybrid has benefited productivity at 279%. And the missing percentage and why not hybrid is we've honestly said sometimes we don't have the point, a line in the sand. We didn't measure productivity effectively enough beforehand. And some of us say we don't know, so we're not going to put that down. But the majority of organizations have reported an improvement in productivity. As we move on, we'll notice the challenges we're getting in this new working environment that we constantly are hearing. 44% of our organizations participating in the survey have said that culture remains a struggle for them. 43 says team connection is their challenge, and in engagement levels of employees at 31% remain our challenge. So the solutional initiatives that we constantly are employing to improve that is increased communications at 55. And you'll hear later on that we're going to be talking about performance management, and that's a way of communicating. So 55% of increased communications, 37% have improved their employee engagement initiatives, so learning being one of them, and communication another, team initiatives, really thinking about how you make your ESG or corporate social investment days work for team as well. And if you are in the business, make sure that your meetings are in person so that we're maximizing that connection during those times. And enhanced well-being at 34% is absolutely being used. So really looking at how can we make our health of our team, whether that is financial, physical, emotional, whole person, ED&I, all of those pillars for well-being are definitely being leveraged so that we improve that connectedness in one culture. When we ask our participants, how many requests are you be receiving for working remotely, remembering that we want to be adaptive and responsive to our employees, 1 in 5 organizations are actually getting a request to work remotely. And we ask the question, how many of those requests are actually different from your current working practices? And 8.2 of them are. So that's interesting. So are we ready? Do we know what it is? What does your policy say? Do you have a response ready? Because that data point gives us I might be ready. We met with some people yesterday and they said we've had all of those kind of requests. So be ready. That's definitely something you need to be flexible on and open. I think one of the biggest things is to continuously review this with your team, check in whether they're okay, make sure that they understand that you've got an open door policy around communication, although you're firm on what is operationally required for your organization. So I hope those insights have been helpful. I would love to introduce you to Michelle McDonough, who's going to take us through our next part of the survey findings.
Thank you so much, Amanda. I'm delighted to be with you all here this morning. So my area of focus today is going to be taking you through some of the key strategic HR areas, and we're concentrating on looking at gender pay gap, performance management, and pension. So starting off firstly with gender pay gap, this is a really topical space and it's always interesting to get a sense from our data on where this is at. As we know, the Gender Pay Gap Information Act was signed into law in July of 2021. And as a reminder, where it stands at the moment is that organisations with 250 or more employees were obligated to report by December 22. So those organisations will now be coming into their second year of reporting. Organisations with 150 or more employees will be obligated to report by December of 2024. So those organisations are all very busy, I'd imagine, at the moment, just finalising their reports and getting ready to publish those in December of this year. And next year, we'll have organisations with 50 or more employees being obligated to report by December of 2025. And those organisations, all organisations, are required to take a snapshot date in June. So that's where their actual data is based on the number of employees that are in their organisations in June and the data relevant to those people. And the report that they publish in December will be relevant to that snapshot date in June. So that gives organisations a period of 6 months to prepare their calculations. And it's important to remember that not only are obligations obliged to report on their gender pay gap figures, they're also obligated to provide an explanation for the reasons behind their gender pay gaps and also an outline of any measures that they're taking to address that pay gap. So there's a number of different requirements on organizations. It is a very complex exercise in terms of the feedback that we're getting and the learnings that we're starting to see coming through. So it's very important that organizations, particularly those that are maybe just in the throes of doing it now or are planning to engage in it next year, are very aware of how challenging and complex this scenario is so that they allow themselves sufficient time to prepare for it. So we see over 550 organizations have reported their gender pay gap data in 2022 and 2023. And the CSO reported Irish gender pay gap at 9.6%. Now that's based on 2022 data. And the latest data from Ireland would suggest an average of 11.2%, and that's compared to 12.6% last year. So already we're starting to see a bit of a decline or a reduction in the overall gender pay gap in Ireland, which is obviously a very positive thing. But we have to be, very mindful of how complicated it is for organizations to go on that journey. So in terms of sharing some of our HR Barometer stats with you, you'll see on the slide there, we had 23% of our participants were legally obligated to record the gender pay gap. And that means they sit within that 250 or more employee size. And we had 18% of organizations that were voluntarily deciding to record their gender pay gap. And that's always a point of decision as to some organizations may not be legally required to do it, but they've taken the decision to do it either one, from an EVP perspective to, promote their employer brand and be seen as an equitable employer and being seen to promote that side of it, but also from a practical perspective, just to give themselves more time to go through the process and learning of how to collect that data before they might be legally obligated to publish that information. And we see 1 in 2 organizations are not recording their gender pay gap. So from our survey participants, 1 in 3 organizations believe their gender pay gap is below the national average, and they're reporting to us that their gender pay gap average is 10.7%. So it'll be interesting to see when the reports come in now in end of year and when they're, I suppose, analysed and reported on publicly in maybe February, March of next year, what those stats are looking like. But 10.7%, if that were born to be true, would be another reduction on the figures that have come out from the previous layer of gender pay gaps. So we have 1 in 5 of our participants have introduced new initiatives to try and address the gender balance. And some of those initiatives, when we try and understand what people are focusing on, are embedding diversity and inclusion into talent acquisition strategies. That's coming out at 68%. Increasing flexible work practices at 66%. And we're building in a focus on inclusive recruitment drives, and that's coming in at 55%. So we see 1 in 2 organizations conducting D&I training in 2025, that being the plan. And so there's really, I suppose, an appetite or an interest among Irish organizations to really fundamentally focus on what the gender pay gap our obligations are really all about, which is trying to improve diversity in our organizations and put us in a much more positive position in terms of how we're moving through that journey. It is important to be aware that there's a number of different aspects to the reporting. So there are a list of 5 different requirements, and even within that, there's a requirement to have mean and median gap reporting. So it is quite a complex process to go through. From a development point of view, organizations are required to publicly publish their results on the employer's website. There is a plan for there to be an online portal that the government are developing for organizations to post their results up there, in addition maybe to their own websites, but that's currently under development, not likely to be ready for 2024. So we are still waiting for that to come through, and most likely be 2025 at this stage. The government have also indicated that they're going to bring a change to the date that the reports are due to be published, and that will likely come to November in 2025. And that's important to be aware of, because if your snapshot date is in June, that gives you only a period of 5 months instead of what's currently in place 6 months in order to complete that reporting process. So that is important. And there's also been some changes this year in May announced around how those calculations should be completed. We see things around share options and interest in shares no longer being treated as bonus remuneration. We see changes to the formula used to calculate the total number of working hours. And we've also seen changes around how basic pay is categorized for those on maternity leave, paternity leave, adoptive leave, parents leave, etc. So that both the state benefit that's provided and any top from the employer is both combined to be regarded as part of their basic pay. So a number of different changes in that regard just to be aware of. But there is some more information coming out all the time. The government published an FAQ document just a number of weeks ago, which is providing a little bit more guidance for employers in this very, very much needed area. And then finally on this point, just to make you aware of the EU Transparency Directive that Sarah touched on earlier on. So we know that that's going to come into force in Ireland in June of 2026, so we have a little bit of time to get that underway. But what that will require is another layer of obligation on employers, not just to record the gender pay gap, but also where that gender pay gap is 5% or greater, there will be an obligation on employers to engage in a joint pay assessment. And that's just to dig into, what's behind it and what they're doing to try and improve that figure. And that assessment must be done in cooperation with workers' representatives. So that will add another layer of complexity and obviously involve a much broader range of stakeholders in examining the detail behind those gender pay gap differences. So it really is recommended for employers, whether you're legally obligated to do it or not, to try and get ahead of this as quickly as you can. And that's one of the key learnings from our Barometers series this season. Okay, and our next area is going to be around performance management, always an interesting space to look at. And thankfully, we see some positive progression in this space in that organizations are increasingly putting in place performance management systems where maybe they didn't have them before. We see that sitting at 86% now. But unfortunately, on the other side of it, although they have processes in place, 1 in 10 of our respondents are saying that their processes are not being very effective. So we're really not getting the value out of performance management in the way that we should be. And we know this is a delicate space to get right. It's not always straightforward to do, but it is such a crucial part of the HR toolkit. And it's so important to be able to communicate what the strategic business objectives are, to cascade them down, to help people to make sense of them on an individual and team basis, and then to have a structure and support system there around how those conversations and supports are managed in the delivery with their line managers, and that people are given that consistent feedback and development, and of course then how it links into reward. So performance management can have such a big impact on your employee retention, on your engagement, and all those other key HR areas. So I really would encourage organizations to consider this more deeply. We see 29% of our respondents are implementing more regular reviews, and they're believing this will have the biggest impact on performance management. And that is reflective of, I suppose, of this continual need for pace and change and feedback and agility and driving that learning into our daily practice. We see 1 in 10 organizations planning to change their performance management in the next 12 months, which is a positive thing. And I would encourage not just to make kind of what I call sticky plaster changes, but to actually sit back and really strategically think about how to get this right, because you're right to be cautious, because it is something that, if not done correctly, can actually have the opposite consequence. Some good suggestions here in terms of changes that might be considered in terms of improving or enhancing your current performance management processes. And that's around, again, focus on continuous feedback and dialogue. So not just one review at the end of the year. I think those days are gone. Focusing on both personal and work goals to really try and understand what's important to individuals and engage them in the effort and the focus, and also making sure, obviously, that the business strategic objectives, that they have a role to play in that and they can see how they contribute to that. More integration of learning and development focus. So very much, I think the trend and the continuing trend is about not just giving performance feedback, but about what are we going to do with that and how are we going to build that into a development plan for an individual and help them have that 360 cycle of feedback and supported implementation of learning, and then feedback again, so they can continually improve and enhance themselves, which is obviously a benefit for both the individual and the organization. Ongoing progress reviews with accountability and incentives, obviously very important, particularly in this new hybrid world or remote working world, where it's really important that we give people autonomy, but they are very clearly accountable and have to report on what they're achieving, and they're incentivized to do that. Focusing on agility and collaborative goals as well. So we're not just working in isolation, but do we understand how the team are working together and what our collective goals are? And then data-driven performance analysis. So there is a continuing demand and expectation around having clarity and insight into how we're performing, what are the metrics showing, is it transparent, is it objective, can I challenge it, I really need to understand it. And, you know, HR professionals are being tasked, as well as line managers, to make sure that they can have those robust conversations with employees to bring more integrity to the performance management conversations. And then our final area is around pensions and retirement. And when we look at this space, we see, you know, the introduction of the auto-enrollment retirement savings scheme is a very critical and big change that's coming to force in this space. We now know it's been given a name, and so it's being called My Future Fund, and that auto-enrollment will start from the 30th of September 2025, and that's going to affect 800,000 employees in Ireland. So that people will be automatically enrolled in a new pension scheme if they are an employee aged between 23 and 60, if they're not currently part of a pension plan, and they earn €20,000 or more per year. So that's really significant in terms of, obviously, from a national point of view of future-proofing the economy, but also from an individual employee perspective, that they are aware that this is coming, that organizations are prepared to enact it, because it is something that's mandatory. And at the moment, from a retirement age perspective, we see that organizations, 1 in 10 of our respondents are saying they have no set retirement age or policy. 3 in 4 organizations have no plans to change their retirement age, and yet 1 in 2 are allowing people to work beyond retirement age. So for the most part, we do still have organizations that have 65 as their retirement age in their contracts, and they are allowed to retain that as it stands. But we see what's actually happening in real terms, where organizations aren't planning to change that, is that from a practical perspective, almost 50% or 50% of our organizations are actually allowing people to work beyond that. So it is very important to be careful around how you can justify that retirement age in the first place from an objective perspective, and then also how you're actually dealing with any requests that come from each individual, because we know it's a very complex space from a legal perspective, and there's been a lot of interesting case law in this space to I suppose, rightly put employers on caution when they are making some of those decisions. From a pension contribution perspective, we see 1 in 3 organisations do contribute to pension schemes, and the majority of those are sitting at the 5% level. So that gives you an indication of the volume of employer contribution to pension that is in place. Now, when I talk about auto-enrollment, we know that for a long time we haven't had insight and information on it, so it is something that's really just starting to come to the fore now. Now that we have a set date, we know that we have almost a year to get prepared for it, and the government have started to publish a lot more information on this in the last number of weeks. So if you haven't updated on it in recent times, I would say now is the time to really start looking at that and to bring yourself up to speed with what the government have published on this. Not surprisingly, really, when we asked our survey participants how prepared they were for auto-enrollment, we had 1 in 3 say that they weren't prepared. And I think, as I said, I'd like to think that that has improved a little bit, even since we've done the data, but it will need to improve quite dramatically over the coming months as organisations prepare to put this into effect. But it is important to be aware that not all of your employees will be impacted by auto-enrollment. So we're seeing organisations reporting that 43% of their employees will be auto-enrolled. So when they look at their staff populations, they're estimating about 43%. So it's really just, I suppose, our advice to employers is around making sure that you do look at your data set, you do look at the obligations around auto-enrollment, you get a sense of who is going to be impacted, how practically are you in a position to process that change through your payroll structures, and of course, really importantly, the process that you're going to go on in terms of communicating and engaging with employees to explain that this is coming and establish these processes with them so that it's not coming as any surprise and people have enough notice. And there is a new public body called the National Automatic Enrolment Retirement Savings Authority. They will be charged with administering the scheme, and those percentages, as we know, will start at the lower level of 1.5% and increase to 6% from an employee and employer perspective, and the government will also make a contribution. So that scale will increase from the first year through to the 10th year. So yeah, some interesting stats around that, and just good, I suppose, as a reminder to everybody that all of these key strategic areas, I know they take a lot of time and they are daunting in their own right, but it's important that we start to build a focus on these for 2025 and allow some time and scope to get these things right in your organisations. So I'll hand you back over now to my colleague Sarah, who will take you through our section on pay.
Thank you so much, Michelle. A lot of great information there, and hopefully the Fingal members will take it back to their business in order to help inform those strategic decisions that are being made in the upcoming weeks and obviously prior to 2025. So as always, we look at pay and benefits, and in particular, if we consider the market as it has been over the last number of years, there is a definite strain on businesses and organizations when it comes to total reward. In particular, because of the high but decreasing inflation that was experienced over the last 18 months, there was definitely an expectation from employees in relation to their employers sort of safeguarding their interest when it comes to their financial well-being. In particular, that seems to be continuing in 2024, where 86% of organization survey participants have stated that they're increasing salaries in 2024. Now, as always, when we conduct the HR Barometer, in particular the second series each year, which is always like in Q3, Q4, the expected increases for the following year are always much lower. So that's why we're seeing 66% of survey participants who intend to increase salaries in 2025. I think what will influence and impact on that is what will happen with the economy next year, where we stay or stand as a country in terms of our economic prevalence, and how organizations are able to adapt that to their own businesses and how they will apply total reward sort of reviews when it comes to salaries, we'll have a clearer picture as we move into 2025. However, for 2024, we've seen a 3.7% salary increase. And when we asked our survey participants back in at the end of Q1 of 24 what they anticipated landing on in terms of any salary increases for 2024, it did indicate a very similar figure at 3.6%. But in totality, we've come in at 3.7%. And again, asking the question in relation to 2025, our survey participants have said, they anticipate salary increases in the range of 3.6% in 2025, which I would caveat will likely change depending on what happens with the economy and the market next year. And we will provide that up-to-date information to you when we have it in 2025. What I would say and what is happening at third parties is also really important to look at. So following today's session, we'll obviously provide you with access to the key findings report so you can delve a little bit deeper into that information. And you will see in that report that we reference the number of third-party interventions that arose over the past 12 months. So I'm talking about Labour Court, WRC, where pay claims went to either conciliation or, a direct pay claim under the Industrial Relations Act or a piece of legislation of that nature. What we saw was that there was 112 pay claims. Of those, 2/3 were in the range of 3 to 4%. Those were the recommendations when it came to those pay claims. And 1/3 of those were actually in excess of that. And I think that is more to do with, if you look at the case law and some of the recommendations that had issued, more to do with the fact of the industry itself. So we've often seen, and we have been benchmarking this information, as I mentioned at the start, for 8 years. And since then, the pay or salary increases have tended always to be captured in the 3 to 4%. So it is of no surprise that those averages are applying this year and anticipated for 2025, particularly when we look to 2025 and 2026, as my colleague Michelle mentioned, in relation to the gender pay gap reporting, the pay transparency directive. We're really curious and interested to know of the business in the Fingal Chamber, are you intending to change your pay models in 2025 or beyond to align to the EU pay transparency directive and the requirements under there? For our survey participants, almost 8 out of 10, 79%, have stated that they do not intend to change their pay model. So whatever process or framework that they have in place, it is evidently working for them and it is sustainable. For those that are saying it is not sustainable, 13% intend to change their pay model in the upcoming year. And delving a little bit further down into that, we looked at the top reasons why pay models are being changed. 29% of survey participants of those that said they're changing their pay model say it's just because it is not sustainable. And I think that is, primarily due to the fact of the market and what has happened with the economy over the last 24 months. And it put considerable strain on businesses who had to react in order to retain key talent. Obviously, being at full employment and the labour shortages that are being experienced by businesses throughout Ireland have caused them to respond to expectations from an employee's perspective, and also safeguarding their interest in ensuring that they're retaining the top talent. That moves on to the second top reason for those who are intending to change their pay model next year, where 25%, 1 in 4, is saying the retention of employees is the primary reason that they're doing it. As always, a word of caution, as I'm sure you'd all appreciate, it is about sustainability, in particular where we're looking, to introduce growth models across sectors and industries. It's really important that whilst we operate in a very tight labour market. And whilst absolutely there are individual circumstances where you can respond and react in terms of requirements, retaining top talent, that it needs to be sustainable. So looking at and reflecting on your pay models or pay frameworks or your total reward frameworks is incredibly important as we go into 2025, when we know that we'll be operating in a skill shortage, in a tight labour market, and that will continue for the next 3 to 5 years. So whatever we do now is highly important, in particular in advance of the EU Pay Transparency Directive being transposed into Irish legislation. And the final reason, or top reason why pay models are being changed, are employee expectations. 14% of survey participants say that they are responding to those expectations. Over the last number of years, with the myriad of legislative changes being introduced, it's so important that we're considering it from a value and sustainability perspective, again, because of the additional budget sort of expectations or requirements that have come from a legislative point of view, and what is anticipated to come in 2025 with things like auto enrollment, as my colleague Michelle discussed. We always need to also understand, when it comes to salary increases, what are the contingencies, without it being a fait accompli. Whilst if you're lucky enough to be in the position that it can just apply within your business and throughout your business, it's not the same case for every organization. And essentially, since 8 years ago when we commenced this survey, it always has stemmed to profitability and affordability. Those have always been the top two contingencies as to why salary increases are being applied. And it's no different this time around, with 1 in 2, 53% saying company profitability will drive those salary increases, and 52% saying company affordability will drive those salary increases. Obviously, we'll have a cohort of survey participants where they are attached to salary scales. So that is why 22% are saying that those contingencies will apply those automatic salary increases. But we still have the workplace changes being achieved as a precursor to applying salary increases, which is interesting since we have moved far away from the pandemic. It's still influencing what we're trying to do in our businesses, with 14% of survey participants saying that they will apply salary increases this year in terms of those changes being achieved. Unconditional increases at 12%, again, 1 in 10 organizations saying they are applying unconditional increases, is most likely in response to retention or attraction of key talent into their business. And that could be due to additional pressures within the sector, depending on the skills requirement. But again, I think we need to, lay down a foundation of sustainability when it comes to our pay models and our total reward packages. We also wanted this time around to introduce a new question whereby, where profitability is a precursor to salary increases applying, understanding what is that minimum threshold that is expected to be reached before salary increases can even be entertained. You can see from the data in front of you, first of all, 16% are not aware of the information relating to this question or how to respond. But for the others, we're seeing 30% are saying that minimum threshold is 70 to 79% of profitability or progress against targets. Again, a very interesting figure, because as we know, it's always the 90% threshold is where you get to reinvest in your business. But obviously, responding to what's happening in the market may be an influencer of that information. And again, we're seeing higher numbers when it comes to the threshold of 80% or 80 to 89% of profitability being reached, by 23% of survey participants saying that they will then apply salary increases. And at the top level, the minimum threshold of profitability or progress against targets being 90 to 100%, 30% of survey participants, so 1 in 3, are saying that is the minimum threshold that has to be reached in order to apply the salary increases. So it's always good to understand what's happening across markets, and in particular, because the next question is always about bonuses. So just just bringing you to that information, and from our key insights, we have seen that 1 in 2 are intending to pay bonuses in 2024. 2 in 5 of our survey participants said that they are not paying bonuses in 2024, with the remaining survey participants not in a position at the time when we rolled out the survey to actually respond to that question. So again, the top 3 bases for paying bonuses, as Michelle discussed in terms of performance management, we really need to center and focus on the individual employee's performance throughout the year. Our survey participants also agree, with 69% of those saying that that will be the basis for paying a bonus in 2024. 56%, so just over 1 in 2, are saying that the organization is performing well in 2024. It's achieving its targets. Again, you would imagine that those are the thresholds of 90 to 100 that are applying salary increases, but it's dropped down when it comes to bonuses. 1 in 2 saying that the organization's performance will be reviewed, and 30% of survey participants want to reward employees for their loyalty or for staying with them in 2024. So again, if we go back to the strategic priorities, whereby we have talent retention, employee engagement, experience, and talent acquisition as a top 3 priorities, we need to ensure that as HR practitioners approach 2025 and driving that people agenda and the transformation needed to deliver tangible business outcomes, that we're setting out strategic direction and journeys and maps in relation to retention, engagement, and experience to effectively ensure that we get to this point at the end of 2025 where salary increases and bonus payments can be made. As always, we're always interested to understand, when it comes to bonuses, what is the average percentage of salary that is being paid out in bonuses? And across sectors, this is an average, obviously, it's coming in at 9.9%. That is the average percentage of salary being paid out in bonus in 2024. But always, it's really important to ensure you're bringing this information back to your business, see what you're attempting to do when it comes to salary increases, how it benchmarks against the market averages that are provided in this information. And of course, we will ensure that we will set you up with access to our key findings so you can delve a little bit deeper, as I said, in relation to the HR Barometer findings. The last thing that I would just mention when it comes to total reward and pay and benefits, and I know my colleague Michelle has referenced to the EU Pay Transparency Directive, speaking with a lot of organisations, both in Dublin and nationally, there's a lot of organisations who potentially aren't aware, or it's not on the agenda for 2025 when it comes to the requirements of the EU Pay Transparency Directive. And as we know, with any EU directive, the government may transpose it or indicate that, from the EU position, it has to be transposed by June 2026. But that date may come earlier, in particular, as they'll probably be looking at individual pieces of legislation, amending the Gender Pay Gap Information Act and so forth. And it's really important, or will be instrumental for organizations to ensure that they are actually preparing for the EU Pay Transparency Directive, looking at their pay models in 2025, because once it is transposed, there will be little time for you to actually put that investment into what will work and what will be sustainable for your business in 2026. So we would urge anyone here today, if you'd like to talk about it in more detail, we'd be more than happy to arrange a call with you to provide you some of that key information in relation to the upcoming directive. I want to extend my thanks to Fingal Chamber and to my colleagues Michelle and Amanda for presenting some of that key data. A member of our team will be in touch with you to provide you access with the key findings. And as always, we will sure to bring you any relevant updated information in the HR and employment law landscape through Fingal Chamber. And if you'd like to speak with us, please do reach out to us. We just highlight that the performance management training workshop is something that we're putting on in the coming weeks. If you've any interest in attending, please do reach out to us. Thank you again for your time, and to Fingal Chamber for hosting, and we hope to see you again soon.